Welcome to the joint Bank of Portugal and the IB conference on investment, digitalization and green financing, the Portuguese case. My name is Ricardo Santos. I'm an economist at the IB Economics Department, and I'll be virtually presenting the event today. This is the third edition of this joint conference between our two institutions, where we take the opportunity to not only to present the conclusions from the IB investment survey, but also to take stock on the current stance and outlook for investment in Portugal and in the EU. Unfortunately, this year, we don't have the opportunity to meet physically in Portugal, as in previous years. But as you can see from the program agenda, we have extremely interesting set of panelists today. The conference will start with the welcome remarks by the Governor of the Bank of Portugal, Mr. Mário Centeno. And then Mr. Centeno's intervention will be followed by a keynote speech by the European Commissioner, Mrs. Elisa Ferreira. Following these two interventions, Pedro de Lima, the head of EIB Economic Studies Division, will provide an overview of the EIB investment report and the survey for the EU, and I will provide a brief overview of the results for Portugal. Then, after this macro overview, we'll have a panel moderated by our chief economist, Deborah Revoltella, which will focus on the views on investment from those on the ground, from a company, a bank, ADP, bank, CGD, and also from the central bank. And as well, we'll have someone from the director from our operations department explaining the operations of the IB in Portugal. Finally, the event will be closed by a speech from the IB Vice President, Ricardo Mourinho Felix. And without further ado, I will pass the virtual floor to Mr. Mário Centeno. Mr. Governor, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you very much for all of you for your presence. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to this webinar, organized by Banco de Portugal, together with the European Investment Bank, to debate current trends in investment in Portugal. So my first words are a very warm thank you to the Vice President of the IB, Ricardo Mourinho Felix, my previous colleague and a good friend. I would also like to extend a special welcome to our guest of honor, Professora Elisa Ferreira, European Commissioner for Cohesion and Reforms, who will deliver a keynote speech. The event emerged with the purpose of presenting the results of the annual EIB investment survey, launched in 2016 to Portuguese policymakers and representatives from the business community. It has become an increasingly relevant forum to discuss the dynamics behind investment in Europe and in Portugal. The 2020 EIB investment survey focused on how business investment has been affected by the pandemic and how firms are responding to the challenges posed by digital transition and climate change. Understanding these dynamics is very important to envision the economic recovery, given that the pandemic hit activity extremely hard and has also accelerated structural changes that will transform our economies and way of living. So our challenge will not only be to recover from the crisis, but also to adapt to the changes set in motion, using the drive of the recovery to implement the necessary changes. I want to anticipate the results of the survey, which will be presented by Pedro Lima later on. My intention in this opening address is to give you some information that frames the results of the survey. So I will start by commenting on the performance of the Portuguese economy in the current crisis. Portugal finished 2020 with a less severe recession than previously thought. Data for the fourth quarter revealed a better performance of the economy than expected. The contraction is estimated to have been 7.6%, less than the estimates that exceeded 8% that prevailed in all forecasts since July. The same is true for the unemployment rate, at 6.8% at the end of 2020, a much lower figure than in our previous December forecast. This evolution of the labor market is partly explained by the adoption of measures at containing the severity of the crisis, such as public moratoria, state-guaranteed credit lines, which kept credit flowing in the economy, and maybe above all, the simplified furloughs instrument, which allowed firms to preserve their workforce, but also to the reduction in the number of hours worked. These measures explain why, in the context of the more severe lockdown implemented in peace times, firms were able to retain workers. Employment with more than 1 year of tenure increased in Q4 2020 compared with the same period of 2019. There were more than 88,000 workers in 2020 compared to 2019. This is in stark contrast to when compared with the initial stages of the sovereign debt crisis, in which longer-term employment was massively destroyed, a reduction between 2012 and 2013 of 192,000 jobs. These two numbers alone represent the essence of the difference between the two crises in the labor market and are 280,000 of jobs, a figure that is 75% of the unemployment numbers in Q4 2020. So for you to have an idea of the importance of these developments to understand the behavior of unemployment in 2020. I must remember all of you that there is a thin line between the two scenarios, nevertheless. That's why it is so much important that the support measures be kept in place until all sectors in the economy begin to grow and for the economy to reopen soon. The risks ahead of us are immense, almost pandemic. Looking at 2021, we can expect to have a rebound, although probably not as strong as it could be, were not for the recent pandemic developments, namely the third wave and the confinement measures adopted. In spite of last Saturday's announcement, there is still some degree of uncertainty in the short run. The Portuguese government presented a plan to ease the confinement measures in place, a step certainly welcomed by all businesses as it allows for a more secure planning of productive activities. Nonetheless, the plan is contingent on the pandemic developments that will be observed in the coming weeks and months, where vaccines are going to be a key factor, along with developments to address new challenges posed by the pandemic evolution. There is no rest in the fight against the crisis impact. If exports of goods, excluding energy goods, in the second semester of 2020 already recovered to 2019 figures, the services, especially hospitality, trailed the recovery by a large margin. In the first quarter of the year, GDP will contract, the size of which will depend on how firms and other economic agents handle the lockdown. In any case, the contraction is expected to be clearly smaller than that observed in the first months of the first lockdown. Afterwards, we continue to see a gradual recovery, even if asymmetric and uneven across sectors. We continue to expect that GDP will go back to its pre-crisis level at the end of 2022. The projected recovery benefits from the impact of monetary policy decisions and budgetary response to the crisis. But the European funds are crucial. They will impact the economy directly and through the stimulus generated in the European economy itself. High-quality investment in the green and digital economies are expected. This should translate into higher productivity levels, supporting the supply side of the economy in the medium and long run. The role of national authorities, the European Commission, and the European Investment Bank to deliver this outcome is key. The real challenge is the need to allocate the funds correctly, preserving competition between firms. The broad priorities that have been established at the European level also include reinforcing social expenditure as a way to mitigate inequality. All these priorities are growth-oriented. If they are correctly implemented by all member states, we will also deepen economic integration, reinforcing the single market. We need to make the most out of this opportunity to take on projects that are already mature enough to speed up implementation. Before focusing on the investment opportunities ahead of us, to build a sustainable and robust economy, it is worth reflecting about the trajectory of investment in the Portuguese economy. In 2020, gross fixed capital formation dropped by only 2.2%, clearly less marked than that observed in previous recessions, and rather interestingly, when compared to most European countries. However, the main components had different developments. Investment in construction, for example, increased 4.8%, while investment in machinery fell 7.7%, and in transport equipment, a much larger 27.2% drop. Contrasting with previous recessive episodes, the share of gross fixed capital formation in GDP increased in 2020. Even when excluding the construction component, this share remained unchanged. And this is totally novel in crisis periods in Portugal. This behavior can only signal that the market has strong expectations about the performance of the Portuguese economy going forward. This is both an opportunity and a responsibility. It increases the demand to devise the most correct investment policies for the coming years. These expectations are also reflected in Banco de Portugal projections in the December 2020 Economic Bulletin. Gross fixed capital formation is expected to grow at around 4% on average in the 2021-2023 period. The recovery in investment will be supported by the inflow of European funds, in particular those related to the Next Generation EU. Other contributing factors are the measures supporting firms' financial situation and the monetary policy measures, which translate into favorable financing conditions. These recent events and the past going forward are even more relevant in the historical context of investment in the Portuguese economy. The weight of overall investment in GDP in Portugal declined steadily from 2000 to 2013, from 25.4% to 14.7% at constant prices, mirroring to a large extent developments in construction. However, since 2013, investment has been on an upward trend, only interrupted in 2020 by the pandemic crisis. In 2019, the share of gross fixed capital formation in GDP stood at 18.5%, with the non-construction component corresponding to 9.1% of GDP. These shares stand below but closer to the average observed in the euro area, which have been broadly stable at around 20% and 10% respectively in the period between 2013 and 2018. So the Portuguese economy was catching up in these indicators, which are important to forecast future growth. R&D expenditure as a percentage of GDP in Portugal recorded an increasing trajectory until 2009, when it reached 1.6% of GDP. Subsequently, coinciding with the period of adjustment of the Portuguese economy, there was a contraction until 2015, which was then followed by a recovery to 1.5% of GDP in 2018, placing Portugal at the end of this period in an intermediate position among euro area countries, but considerably below the average, which is 2.2 of GDP. Portugal's relative position in the European Innovation Scoreboard has also improved during this period, placing the country in an intermediate position. All of this is important for you to have an idea of the recent experience of Portugal with investment and the substantial change in composition that occurred during this period. This can only be useful to understand how digital investment and green investment can take place in Portugal in the next few years. So I would like to address these two areas of investment that we associate with a new and sustainable economy. First, let me take on digital investment. The definition of digital investment is quite broad, ranging from ICT technologies to robotics, 3D printing and artificial intelligence, and it complements research and development activities by firms and public institutions. It is widely acknowledged that this type of investments and R&D are important engines for economic growth. Even if we take the classic Schumpeterian approach, in which new technologies are considered as driving growth, even if some destruction of economic activity occurs along the process. The experience of the current pandemic crisis seems to suggest that there has been a technological push related with a surge in the utilization of digital technologies by firms and households. The weight of digitalization-related investment in GDP in Portugal has been steadily increasing from 1.3% at the beginning of this century to 2.1% in 2018, but still stands below the share in the euro area, which is in 2018, 2.6%. The gap derives from a lower share of investment in computer software and databases. It's the component in which we have the biggest difference with European average. These investments, now included in the next generation EU funds, are important to fulfill this gap. Investments associated with the digital transition contained in the Portuguese Resilience and Recovery Plan amount to 2.5 billion euros, which is 1.2% of GDP in 2019. These funds will enhance the development of digital skills by students, investment by firms, and the modernization of public administration. It is key that these funds are well allocated. For this to happen, it is important to overcome barriers to investment with the experience of the EIB, in which the experience of the EIB is key in this regard. Finally, let me briefly take on the green investment. The green investment and the path towards climate transition, we still have limited data. It should be noted that a large part of green investments are embodied in classic investment in buildings, machinery, and transport equipment, but featuring different characteristics regarding energy efficiency and reduction of carbon emissions, for example. And thus, these are harder to isolate and assess. The proposal of the Portuguese Resilience and Recovery Plan includes green-related investments that amount to 2.9 billion euros, 1.3% of GDP in 2019. As in the digitalization dimension, strong scrutiny in the utilization of these funds is important. We have challenging years ahead of us. Portugal faces positive prospects in terms of increasing education levels for the labor force, a structural change that takes several years, decades, I will say, to mature and is still in process. The new funds and the relaunch of the convergence process, which took place between 2016 and 2019, must take these on board. To make sure investment follows skills, as is the case in most examples in market economies, and has been indeed the case in Portugal in the last decade, we think it is important that these funds play a very important role. Well, thank you very much. I wish you a fruitful debate on these important issues for Portugal and Europe, and I hope Portugal can really play an important role in this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Centeno, Governor Centeno. I would now pass the floor for Commissioner Luisa Ferreira for a keynote speech.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Dear Governor, Professor Mário Centeno, dear EIB Vice President, Professor Ricardo Mourinho Félix. I want to salute also all the other speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your invitation to join today, to join you in this event. And in fact, just following what Governor Centeno mentioned, in fact, the emergency response of member states was very strongly supported by the Commission by establishing something that never happened before. And this was to allow for reallocation of all the funds, cohesion funds that were not yet completely spent, in order to support the emergency action. And in fact, now we have, as very correctly Professor Mário Centeno mentioned, to look forward, to look ahead of us. And in fact, to look ahead of us in a world that is on the verge of a fundamental transformation. COVID has been a great accelerator of the trends that were already emerging. The twin transition to a digital economy and to a green, carbon neutral, new way of organizing our economy. COVID is also an X-ray to our societies, including an X-ray that detects the asymmetries and the problems that we face with. We had a taste of this last year during lockdown. We saw what it would be like to telework more and use more of the potential of the digital world while avoiding the risks. We still see that every day as many continue to work from home, and we also saw what it would be like to have fewer cars, quieter streets, and cleaner air. So there are some lessons to be taken from this period. In the coming years, we will see a profound transformation. Today's conference is then very appropriate because this future vision will not happen smoothly simply because we wish it or hope for it. It will also not be stopped just because we don't like it or some of us don't like it. So what we need is in fact to shape and to manage this transformation, seizing the opportunities and tackling the challenges that will come our way. We need to anticipate, act, and reform the way we produce and consume, the way we work, and the way we heat our houses, how we move, and how we live. And this will require vision, determination, and, I underline, massive investment. The Commission has estimated that reaching a 40% reduction of our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 would require 260 billion euros of investment a year. With a much more ambitious target of a 55% reduction by 2030 that we have now collectively agreed, the financial needs will be considerably higher. And this is before we consider the other target, the digital needs. So our motto must be all hands on the deck. We need all available private and public funds, national and European. We need the investments of the EU budget of cohesion policy, Horizon Europe, and all the other European Union programs. We need too the investments of Next Generation Europe, but also of the European Investment Bank and the many commercial and development banks across Europe. We need private investment, and we must encourage more risk-taking in Europe. We need entrepreneurs and venture capital, and we need to attract foreign investors to Europe. And we must multiply public funds by involving private investors through greater use of financial instruments. In a nutshell, more investment, public and private, will be essential to build a new, cleaner and more digital economy. A more competitive economy that can support our, some call it, European way of life. In other words, we all have to work to do, we all have work to do at the European Commission, at the European Investment Bank, at the level of the central banks, namely Banco de Portugal, and European system of central banks. Until now, together, we have been the guarantors of financial stability in the European Union. We also need to be the enablers of a successful transition. To frame this common work, I will address three specific points. First, what cohesion policy has been doing and what we bring to the table. Second, where I see the needs in the coming years. Third, where I would see next steps in terms of our common work, and especially where the EIB also has a role to play. First, what cohesion policy has been doing and what we bring to the table. Cohesion policy is the European Commission main investment tool. Its strategic goal is to support economic, social, and territorial cohesion, aligned with our overall political goals and priorities. And over the 2014-2020 program period, European cohesion policy has invested over 14 billion euros already in digitalization and 51 billion euros in meeting climate and energy targets. Cohesion policy makes a key contribution to delivering the digital single market objectives on the ground by focusing investments on tackling the digital divide, both the social divide and the geographical divide. We do this by supporting the digitalization of companies, by improving access to e-government and e-health, by boosting digital skills, and by fostering the rollout of broadband in remote and rural regions, so that, in fact, no region is left behind. In Portugal, over the period 2007-2020, so the period of the funding that still is operating until 2023 in terms of payments, almost 21% of all cohesion investments went into research and development, including innovation as well. And more than 11% in support for companies in order to stimulate and improve their competitiveness. In the most recent period, so 2014-2020 alone, cohesion policy supported 307 million euros of digital investment. This is having a significant impact on many beneficiaries in Portugal, from universities to small and medium companies, from the border control service to the training of citizens, from public authorities to hospital investment. We have been promoting also climate investments in energy efficiency in both public buildings and housing, green mobility from clean urban transport to railways, projects with small and medium companies and technology transfer, renewable energy. These objectives not only will continue, but they will be reinforced in the coming years. We are currently negotiating with all member states the new generation of the European Union cohesion funds for the period 2021-2027. And cohesion policy will play a key role in projects like the renovation wave or smaller but not less interesting projects as new European Bauhaus. We will build mobility into urban design, aiming for cities with zero carbon impact, and will support recycling systems for all materials. In future, this work will only increase. The new programs are still in preparation, but the back of the envelope calculation suggests that only in Portugal, cohesion support to energy, climate, and environmental related investments will be of the broad order of 5 billion euros. Cohesion policy will continue its work in strong partnership with actors at all levels. We need to involve everybody in the development of new projects and the implementation of programs. And of course, in the implementation of the regional development strategies. And I say all, I mean national, regional, and local public players, social partners, the civil society, the private sector, and the financial sector. Cohesion policy delivers in all regions with a focus on those with the greatest needs. All must participate in maximizing its impact. And this brings me to my second point, where I see needs in the coming years. In 2020, Portugal entered for the first time, and the governor just mentioned it, the ranks of the strong innovators in the European Union, according to the European Innovation Scoreboard. This is a major achievement and the results of years of investment in education, in research centers, in companies' innovation capacity, and in researchers themselves, most of it with a strong support from cohesion policy that for certain years was almost the most important supplier of public investment when the contraction determined a lot of scarcity of means to go on investing. A lot was done, but a lot remains to be done. Digital technology in business is still low, as are digital average skills in the population, particularly in certain pockets of population. And this raises a serious risk of digital exclusion, of exclusion from the future economy and the gains it will bring, but also an exclusion in relation to basic public services, as also the supply and the organization of the public administration bets, and rightly so, more and more in services provided through digital connections. Also, many households and smaller cities and towns do not have yet access to high capacity network coverage and mobile broadband. No business can develop in such an environment, and even education is a challenge when schools and training go largely online. The COVID crisis made these challenges more pressing. Schools and companies must be supported to digitalize. Many of the recent changes in cohesion programs introduced following the emergency measures, and these are the ones we took in April and May last year, and I just referred it in my initial words, we called it the Coronavirus Response Investment Initiatives, were exactly directed at that. And we need to continue to provide training in new skills. Upskilling has to be continuous, in line with smart specialization strategies and evolving business needs in each region. In terms of renewable energy, Portugal is, as we all know, performing quite well and progressing. There are European countries blessed with sun, and there are European countries blessed with strong sea winds. Portugal, fortunately, is one of the few countries blessed with both. Portugal has enormous potential in renewable energy, and we can do even more, investing very massively on a permanent effort for research, for innovation, and for adaptation as well. For other environmental issues in Portugal, several important challenges still lie ahead. Sustainable transport. Portugal has one of the highest rates of car passengers transport in the European Union. Circular economy. Portugal recycled in 2018 just a little bit less than 30% of municipal waste, far from the European Union target of 50%. A lot more can be done also to improve energy efficiency in public buildings and to renovate private and social residential buildings. Energy efficiency and insulation of private and public buildings is an area where Portugal has a huge margin of progress. Cohesion policy invested 4 billion euros to address these green challenges in Portugal in the period to 2014-2020. But while this is a significant contribution, we must definitely do more. And this brings me to my third and final point, next steps in terms of our common work. As I already mentioned, the scale of investment means we need all hands on deck. We must mobilize finance from a wide range of sources. Of course, we have cohesion policy with its growing focus on greening and digitalization, together with social and spatial cohesion. We have Next Generation Europe financing the recovery and resilience plans for a recovery that must be based on forward-looking reforms and investments. And we have other European Union programs such as Horizon Europe or Health for EU. We have InvestEU, which benefits from substantial guarantees from the European Union budget. We have, of course, national funds, and we have, of course, the European Investment Bank Group. The EIB is the European Union's bank. The EIB is obviously an important, I would say, an essential partner for us, playing a crucial role in financing major public works, but also in mobilizing private capital. Companies must be able to look to the EIB for their financing, and Portuguese companies must look at all these sources of financing, which can increasingly complement cohesion policy. Some are already doing this, either directly, in particular the larger companies, or through the EIB schemes with local banks. We need to see more of this in the recovery and beyond. I count on the EIB to fulfill their mandate and to provide long-term financing for the European Union business and to support cohesion projects. Support to the European Union cohesion policy as a key treaty objective and an European Union principle is also one of the European Investment Bank's raison d'être. The EIB's target share of signed amounts supporting cohesion policy has, I think, declined over time. And even this declining target has become harder to achieve in recent years. Now, we must re-emphasize the position of the European Investment Bank as the EU bank in relation to EU cohesion policy and to Europe's regions. Although our intervention logics may slightly differ, it is important that financial instruments are also territorially sensitive, geographically balanced, and take into account their spatial impact, because it is very, very relevant. We also count on a tight collaboration in delivering the just transition mechanism. The EIB will play a role delivering two of the three pillars that integrate the just transition mechanism. Here, we must work particularly closely together to ensure that all investments under the just transition mechanism are coherent with the territorial just transition plans, with each just transition region's own development strategy, and combining all these instruments around the strategy is not easy. So we really have to work a lot together. In all areas where we work together, we must ensure that our approaches are aligned. They must be coherent, serving European citizens and taxpayers who provide both funding streams. We also count on the IB expertise. It is fundamental to us. The IB is in a great position to offer technical expertise through its advisory services. It is also a key provider of technical assistance for financial instruments in cohesion policy. We count on this continuing in the next period. There is so much work to be done. We must work closely together to explain our strategies and eliminate any perception of misalignment, of competitiveness between the different European Union instruments and those of the European Investment Bank. We have got to work in synergies and in cooperation. We believe the conditions are there for this. Our commitment to financial instruments is around 25 billion euros in the new period. We provide, of course, and we have to, management fees to ensure that the European Investment Bank has the conditions to make good of these financial instruments and to continue to support cohesion policy. We count on the European Investment Bank to make the most out of it. In conclusion, as the old African proverb says, if you want to travel fast, go alone. If you want to travel far, go together. With the digital revolution and the Green New Deal, Europe's ambition is to travel very far. So we must do it together. Let us put together our investments and our expertise. Let us align our agendas and funds for the common good in constant cooperation. We in cohesion policy bring our track record and experience in the transformation at the local level in every region. We also bring our contacts, our partnerships at various levels. And we count on the IB to bring their expertise in project financing, in setting up and managing financial instruments, and in providing advisory services, particularly in those cases where they are more needed. Together, we can have an impact that makes us proud. Today, we take another step in the road together, that long road to a green, digital, cohesive, and resilient Europe. I look forward to our discussion today. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Luísa Ferreira, for his excellent speech on challenges for both Portugal and Europe. Now, following these two great and comprehensive overviews on investment challenges for Portugal and for the EU, I would pass the floor to Pedro de Lima to present our conclusions from the IB Investment Report and Investment Survey. Pedro, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, Commissioner Ferreira, Governor Centeno, Vice President Maureen Felix, distinguished guests. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to share with you some of the results of the research and analysis that the Economics Department of the European Investment Bank is conducting on investment issues. I'm trying to share my... Am I sharing?
Yes, I think we are seeing it.
Very good. So, as I said, the objective is to share with you some of the key findings and implications for Portugal. And to do this, I'm going to split the presentation in two parts. The first part, which I will have, will give you the main results of the survey and of our analysis for the European context. So we'll be talking about European countries here. In the second part of the presentation, I will delegate that to my colleague Ricardo Santos, who has been doing the host part of this event, and Ricardo will zero in on the results of the survey for Portugal. So what we're going to be talking about here is very simply a number of things that we are putting together in the economics department of the IB. We're conducting since 2016 an annual investment survey. I hope you're all aware of that by now, in which we conduct interviews with firms all across the member states, all across the 27 member states. In addition to that, we conduct the same survey in the UK for obvious reasons. They used to be part of the Union, and in the US. And the US and the UK to a certain extent are very important parts of this survey, because not only we can benchmark within the Union, because this is a unique survey in that regard. When we interviewed 13,000 firms all across the Union and in the US, we can benchmark between European countries, but not only that, we can compare European country performances, the performances of European firms to those of US firms. So we put this information together in our website. You're going to find a country page for each of the member states. You're going to find a publication also for the ensemble of the European Union. And in addition to this, we have a report, an investment report, which we published in late January, which we do every year, analyzing not only the results of the survey, but also all information that is relevant for the analysis of investment developments in Europe. This year, the survey was framed on the concept of building a smart and green Europe in the COVID-19 era. So we obviously cannot come around the impact that COVID is having on very structural issues. And these are issues that we've been talking about for a number of years. The issues of how to make Europe a more competitive economy, a more inclusive society. And so this is the intersection of all these different things. Is what I'm going to try to talk about in the next few minutes, and I'll try to be brief. So what are the main results? The main results are relatively simple. We know that COVID has implied a massive economic shock, which has been met, and this time we have to stress this. It has been met by a very impressive policy response. Compared to the previous crisis of 2008 to 2012, let's put it this way, there was a very decisive policy response at the European level. As we've heard from Governor Centeno, investment was hit hard. At the same time, this shock to investment decisions and activities comes at a time where economic agents have to respond to some increasingly significant challenges, like that of conducting a digital transition, as well as responding to the climate action challenges. And it's on this intersection, on these dual twin transitions that we call it, of digital and green, that's where I would like to focus my presentations, and that of Ricardo as well. The survey has a wealth of information that is by no means confined to what I'm going to talk about here. And as I said before, if you're interested in those results, please, I commend you to look at our website, and you will find a wealth of information there, and both in the country fishes as well as in the investment report. Now, digital and green, these transitions are challenges, but at the same time, they also present significant opportunities for the European economies, for Portugal in particular. We've heard both Governor Centeno and Commissioner Ferreira talking about that. And that's on these two angles that I would like to proceed. Here, I have some macro numbers. I think Governor Centeno has dealt with this better than I could. So I only would like to mention the following. We are recovering. There's a recovery going on, marked by significant uncertainty, with impact in economic agents' decisions in terms of their investment plans. But the opportunity cost of this crisis is severe, and both for the EU and Portugal, we will be back at the pre-crisis levels of GDP by mid-2022, if everything goes as planned. In that regard, Portugal seems to lag a bit behind the EU, but these are just the numbers that we need to keep in mind. And so the challenges that this poses for investment are significant, because in the context of large uncertainty, it's obviously that economic agents are changing their behavior towards what their future investment plans and decisions are. And this comes very clearly. Remember, our investment survey was conducted mostly during the summer of 2020. So we don't have here, the numbers of the survey don't necessarily reflect what has been going on with the second wave and the third wave of the pandemic. They basically reflect what was being known, what was known in the summer of 2020. We had gone through a very tight confinement, lockdown. At the same time, the summer of 2020 was, if anything, a relative easing of conditions. But at that time, 45% of firms in Europe were telling us that they were about to decrease their investment plans due to the COVID-19 crisis. At the same time, and this is, I think, where the paradox or the tension is that firms were also the first ones to tell us, well, we're about to decrease our investment plans, our investment decisions. At the same time, we are fully aware that with the digital and green transitions, we need to invest more. And for example, more than 50% of firms across Europe were telling us that because of COVID, the long-term impact of COVID is that there would be a need, an increased use of digital technologies. A similar sort of numbers, not as significant, that there would be changes to their supply chains and changes to their service or product portfolio. So it's in this tension between the short-term consequences of the pandemic and the long-term impact that we have to analyze what firms have to do and what their plans are. Now, as we know, on this digital transition, one thing that is quite relevant is the comparison with the US. We know that there is on the digital side, there is a gap between European firms and US firms. 37% of European firms have not adopted a single digital technology. And Governor Centeno mentioned this. It's a well-defined concept what we mean by digital technologies. When we ask firms, are you digital or not? We tell them, have you invested in any of these different technologies like artificial intelligence, 3D printing, and so on and so forth. In the US, this number is considerably smaller. 27% of US firms have not invested in digital technologies. It's important to tell you that over the last few years, the number of firms that have not invested in digital technologies has declined, but the gap between Europe and US is relatively constant. So the 10% the percentage point gap that we are mentioning here for 2020 has been in place since 2016. That gap doesn't seem to be going away. On the other hand, if we look at climate investments, 45% of EU firms have invested in climate in the past, and they are a slightly smaller share of those is planning to have further investments in climate in the next 3 years. Those percentages in US are smaller. So European firms seem to be more reactive to the need to invest in the green transition. Now, and this goes back to a point that was made by Commissioner Ferreira. If we want to reduce gas emissions by 2030, according to the Commission numbers, these investments, even though they are higher in Europe than in US, are probably not enough to reach those plans as it stands right now. Now, it's not all bad news. One good news on that we can in the investment report is that when you look at the intersection between digital and green, European firms do better than the US. There seems to be it's a small niche, if you want. On the other hand, there seems to be a commanding lead by European firms that invest in green and that at the same time are developing these green innovations with a digital content. So we don't know how long this gap is going to be maintained, or this lead is going to be maintained. It's probably one area for policymakers to look into and see what sort of conditions need to be provided for European firms to remain in the lead, both not just vis-a-vis the US, but also vis-a-vis the emerging China or Japan or South Korea, those countries that seem to be in the lead when it comes to R&D. Now, one thing that is of relevance for an institution like the IB, we ask firms, what are your main obstacles to investment? And typically, this year was obviously massively dominated by concerns about uncertainty. Firms, more than 85% of firms across Europe elected this obstacle as their main obstacle going forward. Typically, we also get very strong concerns with the ability of finding staff with the right skills. But one area that seems to have lost a bit of importance in recent years is the issues of access to finance. Here in this slide, I'm trying to give you an overview of the heterogeneity that you have in Europe on how firms tell us how they perceive issues of access to finance. On the left-hand side, and we have the overall responses at the EU level. So, and there's a huge range. So Danish firms, around 8% of Danish firms mention access to finance as a major impediment for investing. On the other hand, at the other end of that distribution, you have Spain. Spain, where something like 45% of firms tell us that access to finance is a major impediment. Now, one of the things we do on a regular basis on our investment reports is to try to look at heterogeneity across Europe, and we distinguish usually amongst three different regions. We look at what we call Southern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, and Northern and Western Europe. Sometimes these are known as periphery, accession countries, and Northern and core Europe. But these labels these days don't get a lot of traction, so we stick to the geography. And you can see that even within Southern Europe, which is the region where more firms tend to tell us that access to finance is a bit of a problem, there's quite a bit of a range. Portugal is actually the country within Southern Europe that where firms list access to finance fewer times as a major impediment. Spain, we already knew that is the country that where firms perceive access to finance as a more important challenge. And then if you want, you have a range, you have a grading in Central and Eastern Europe, it's somewhere in between South and the more developed countries or the more developed economies, within the EU, which are the northern and Western European countries. And you can see that the share of firms that tell us in North and Western that access to finance is a bit of a problem, or it's a major impediment to investment, is slightly above 10%, with a range that goes from Denmark to Germany. Now, one of the things where we see a significant difference between this crisis and previous episodes is that with COVID, the complaints of firms have gone relatively less to access to external finance, debt finance, or typically in Europe, to issues of internal finance. And the deterioration in internal finance, and that's the graph on your right-hand side, the green line, you can see that has gone significantly below that of external finance, which means that the balance between firms who think that they are well positioned to get internal finance funds and those that do not think so has gone really south. And so this is something that reflects what we know about the crisis, where what we are seeing being depleted is capital buffers, cash buffers, because of the nature of this crisis. It's not so much that firms try to access to banks and so on and are turned down. It's more that they need to replenish their cash buffers because of the nature of the crisis. And this is also has implications in terms of how policymakers should act. And we need to think in relative terms, less so in terms of debt instruments and more so in terms of equity instruments. And this is one of the main messages of our report. Before I conclude and pass on the floor to Ricardo, I was just going to mention something that we also do in our investment report, and it's because we've also conducted a survey across European municipalities, because it's quite important, and it's something that comes quite clear in our report, that is this complementarity between areas where municipalities are relatively better off and where firms are relatively better off. So the two things tend to go together. And so the good news there is that public investment seems to be on the comeback. And the part of the policy response, the European policy response to the crisis, is that we are waiving the Stability and Growth Pact rules for the time being, and so public investment can come back. And we know the catalytic impact that public investment has on private investment. So those are the good news. On the other hand, we have to worry about what might happen in the not so long future with the potential reinstatement of these rules. And we have to also worry, and this is something that comes very strongly from our municipality surveys, about the capacity for some of these municipalities to implement the public investment plans that they are supposed to. And again, heterogeneity across Europe is something that comes very clear. Municipalities in the north and western parts of Europe, in the richer countries of the Union, seem to be relatively better prepared, both in terms of human capacity as well as digital technologies and so on and so forth, with in this case Central and Eastern Europe lagging a bit behind. To conclude, investment is going to be driving how we respond to this crisis, with public investment, as we just saw, having a very important role to play, and firms having to accelerate to transition to a new normal, where innovation, digitalization, and tackling climate change are going to be super important elements. One of the things we stress in our investment report is the need to focus more on equity type instruments. And I would like to leave this part of the presentation with a positive note. The digital and green transitions create challenges, but they can also offer opportunities. They are potentially going to create a significant number of jobs. Here, an important element to keep in mind is that these jobs that are going to be created by the digital and green transitions tend to be high-skilled jobs. And so to prepare, one of the things we do in our investment report is to look at regions in Europe that are more at risk of this digital and green transition. And unfortunately, some parts of Portugal, some of the regions in Portugal are potentially impacted by the challenges of the green and digital transitions. And here the message is that we need to invest in human capital. We need to invest in the skills of the European populations, of the Portuguese populations, so that they can benefit and can grab the opportunities created by these twin transitions. Thank you very much for your attention, and I pass on the floor to Ricardo.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Now putting on my economist hat on, I would zoom in on the results of the survey for Portugal. As Governor Centeno already pointed out, what's been happening with investment since the pandemic, I'll have the easier task of just focusing on what were the results of the survey. So starting on the first slide with what is the impact of COVID. So around 50% of the firms reported that they expect to invest less because of the impact of COVID. That's not entirely surprising, and it's only a bit more than the EU average, which is around 45%. What's interesting here is to notice that large firms seem to be more impacted than SMEs. So 55% of large firms report that they will invest less, whereas in SMEs, it's only 45%, as you can see in that chart in the left. I guess that one of the reasons for this could be that they were the ones actually reporting higher investment intentions before COVID struck the world, and as it was reported in our previous wave of the survey from 2019. Then, when we see the long-term impact of COVID, those impacts are a bit different than they are from the EU to the EU, and what Pedro was reporting a few slides before. As you can see on the right, the main impact forecasted or predicted by the Portuguese firms is on changes to service or product portfolio. So not an increase on digital technologies, which comes in number 2, and it's not that different for the relation with the EU average, but the main priority is to change in services or product portfolio, and then supply chain is also a more relevant factor than it is for the EU. Employment comes with a big distance as a fourth expected impact of COVID over the long term, but still, I mean, the percentages here can be a bit misleading, because 20% of firms still expect a permanent reduction in employment. I mean, we all know that we were, and as Pedro was mentioning, the survey was done during the summer. We were still in the middle of a recession. I mean, probably firms can be too overly pessimistic, but it's still something to take into account. Then because there is more to COVID than to investment than COVID, we zoom in now on what are the main obstacles to investment, medium-term obstacles to investment in Portugal. We see that also, as in the previous editions of the survey, uncertainty, business regulations, and energy costs are the main obstacles to investment in Portugal. And surprisingly, uncertainty is now a bigger obstacle than it was in the previous wave of the survey. And what is interesting to note here also is that access, so basically infrastructures in general, but specifically access to digital infrastructure, is not only a smaller barrier to investment than it is in the EU, but also smaller than it was in the previous edition of the survey. So to what extent could this mean that actually investment in innovation and digitalization is actually increasing faster in Portugal than EU? That's on the next slides. We see that Portuguese firms reported higher share of innovation than EU firms during the last fiscal year. And this is more the case of manufacturing in large firms. So if we go then to construction or infrastructure or to SMEs, we see that the share of innovation either is in line with the EU average or even a little less than with the construction. But still, the marginal message here is that Portuguese firms on average innovated or reported more innovation than the EU. And not only that, but also not only innovations new to the company, but also new to the country and to the world. And on digitalization, we go on the next slide to see if this is the same. And if we have the same message, and we do, although with a slight less marked stance. Portuguese firms report more investment or more adoption of digital technologies than EU firms. So not only just single, but also multiple adoptions in digitalization. I mean, the share here, the difference here is not overwhelming. In the case of Portugal, it's 68% of firms reported. In the case of EU, it's 63%, but still it's bigger. And actually, Portugal could be relatively more similar to the US in terms of the adoption of digital technologies than to the EU. But then this has a caveat, and this is what I show in the chart there on the right, is that we all know, and this was something that was being mentioned by Commissioner Ferreira and by Governor Centeno as well, Portugal still lags the EU in terms of adoption of digital technologies, namely software and other more specific investments. It still lags the EU, and we see that in terms of investment in research and development, Portugal has a smaller share than the EU. Still, the share is 1.4% of GDP, and the EU is 2.2%. So this is definitely a positive thing to point out, the fact that Portuguese firms are not only innovating more, but investing more in digitalization. But this is the first steps of many steps towards catching up with what's happening in terms of the EU. Then when we turn to green, the first takeaway, and this is on the chart on the left, that when we ask the companies what is their expected impact of climate change, I mean, in their outlook and in investment prospects, we see that Portuguese firms expect a higher impact of climate change than the EU average. The difference is quite starting, as you can see there in the chart in the left, is almost double in terms of no impact at all what is expected by the EU and by Portuguese firms, but they've invested less than the average. I mean, that's seen on the chart on the right. They intend to invest in the future more or less the same as the EU. That's the darker green bars on the chart on the right, but to report less investment in the past year than the companies in the EU. So this begs the question, I mean, what is holding back investment in climate? And we see this there in this chart that has a bit more, so it's as the chart that I was showing before in terms of the medium-term obstacles to investment, but is the question that we ask here specifically on climate. We see that uncertainty, not only about regulation, but also about climate change in general, and costs are the main barriers to green investment for Portuguese firms, and all are higher than they are for the EU average. So these are clearly probably show that there is some room or scope for policy support towards improving green investment. And although availability of finance is not among the main obstacles to investment in green transition, it is a higher obstacle than it is for the EU average. And we'll go a bit deeper on that on the next slide. We see, and this was something that Pedro was mentioning before on the left, that access to finance continued to improve in Portugal. We can see there on that chart that since 2016, so since the first edition of our survey, the share of financially constrained firms in Portugal, with the addition of our firms, from 13%, which at the time was almost double of the EU average, now is even a bit lower than the average for the EU. So this is definitely good news in terms of the prospects for investment. But we see that it's still a bigger obstacle for green investment than for the EU average. And when we, given that the only priority is not also green and climate transition, but also digital, we see that for digital is not as big as, is basically the same size of problem for the EU, but for green is a bigger obstacle for Portuguese firms. So again, this seems to hint that there is some scope for policy intervention. And then before closing this presentation, I'll just leave you with the main conclusions. As I was mentioning, firms expect that the pandemic will leave big impact, so they expect 50% of decline in investment, and will have lasting effects in terms of their prospects. As I was mentioning, a bit different than for the EU average. Uncertainty, regulation, and energy costs remain the main obstacles to investment, although uncertainty is now a bigger obstacle than it was in previous editions. Investment in innovation and especially in digitalization, and also in digitalization, have been above the EU average, but as I was mentioning, this is probably part of a process of catching up that Portugal still needs to continue to do. Firms expect a higher impact of climate change, but are still investing less than the EU, although they expect to invest more or less the same in the future. And then finally, access to finance continues to improve and is even a bit better than the EU average, but is a bigger obstacle to green investment than it is for the EU average. I would stop here and pass the floor now to Deborah for the next panel. But before that, I would just wanted to mention that we already had a couple of questions through the chat. And I would want to tell that you can feel free to drop any questions. I mean, we don't have any Q&A session because of the interest of time. But feel free to drop any questions through the chat, and then we are more than happy to get back to you or to pass the questions to the panel speakers. Floor is yours, Deborah.
Thank you very much, and it's really an honor to have the opportunity of chairing the forthcoming panel, which I hope will be an opportunity to dig into various elements that have been introduced by Pedro and Ricardo, and also provide some of the suggestion and discuss on some of the policy message that we heard from Governor Centeno and from Commissioner Ferreira. On a policy point of view, I think what we heard so far is this very strong message that investment on a policy point of view is needed at this point in time. And investment is needed to deal with the post-COVID environment, but also with the pre-existing challenge of a digitalization and green transition trend. And this investment is needed both in the public and the private sector. So on the policy point of view, what we need to make sure is to combine this public and private investment in order to have the right incentives and the right mode of implementation in order to maximize the impact. I will have the honor of chairing the panel and bringing various elements in this debate. On the one side, Birte Brun-Leon, the Director for Operation in the Iberia at the EIB, will start explaining her assessment of the needs for policy intervention and also EIB intervention in Portugal at this phase of the post-crisis, post-COVID crisis, and in the context of the green and digital transition. I can also count in this panel on the contribution of Paulo Macedo, the CEO of Cassa General de Depositos, that will be able to speak more on the bank side. Then Paula Guerra, the Group Head of Finance for Energia de Portugal, that will speak more on the green transition side, and Elena Adegas, Head of Market Department at the Banco de Portugal, that will also speak about the greening of the financial sector. So I give the floor to Birte, and in the first round of the debate, really try to focus on an assessment of the needs related to COVID, to the digital and green transition, and then how the policy response and how the economy has to adapt, looking at between the short-term challenge and the medium to long-term challenge. Berta, the floor is yours.
Yes. Dear Governor of Banco de Portugal, dear Commissioner, dear Vice President, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure for me to open this panel today, in which we count with the presence also of important long-term partners of the EIB. Thank you very much for your participation from my side also, Dr. Macedo, Dr. Teixeira, and Dr. Adegas. We're grateful to Banco de Portugal for organizing and hosting this webinar. Thank you to the Commissioner for her keynote speech, in which she highlighted also her expectations for the EIB. And thank you to you, Deborah, and colleagues from the Economics Department for the preparation and presentation of your interesting investment survey again this year. Hearing about current trends in investment expectations and about investment barriers in our countries of operation is indeed very relevant for us, because the EIB is about supporting EU policy objectives and relevant national strategies and priorities. These political priorities evolve over time in reflection of changing markets and fluctuations of the economic environment, and these in turn influence the investment inclination and investment priorities both of public and private agents. We, as a promotional bank, we identify where our financing can best mitigate suboptimal financing situations, and where we can usefully complement and also catalyze market-based financing. We obviously do not have any direct role in changing business or labor market regulations, in influencing the level of energy costs, or improve the availability of skilled staff. Now, what we can do is we can finance projects that create employment opportunities. We can help to provide liquidity and unlock investment where there's a lack of access to finance, to affordable finance. For instance, in particular in Portugal, for SMEs, where fragmentation of access to finance and financing costs have tended to be important failures in Portugal, particularly in crisis times. We can also contribute to reduce uncertainty when it is related to whether a necessary investment project or investment plan can be financed in a sufficient and sustainable manner in terms of debt capacity. Here we have the larger infrastructure projects. We can also stimulate and accelerate investment in innovative technologies where the risky outcomes of such novel technologies tend to shy off private investors. For instance, for innovative technologies in the renewable energy space, alternative energy sources, etc. And in the pharma industry, obviously. We can also finally help to open up new and also riskier market segments to create alternative access to finance. For instance, capital market solutions for smaller companies, supply chain finance solutions, or simply the provision of longer-term financing, or by way of assumption of higher risks than the commercial banking sector would usually accept, for instance, for RDI projects. Now, how do we do this? We continuously adapt our product and services offer in a way that it can flexibly meet the relevant priorities and instigate necessary technological shifts. Thereby, we always intend to act in a complementary manner, and through our anchor presence in the financing of projects, we want to attract further financing to them. We achieve this full effect, let me call it that way, through inter alia, through one element, which is that we very thoroughly analyze the projects with a diversified team composed of economists, engineers, financial analysts, and environmental specialists that will ensure that the project and the financing are technically, economically, and financially viable, as well as environmentally and socially sound. What this analysis does is two things, essentially. This project-specific analysis provides for a seal of quality, at least that is how it tends to be seen by our clients, that endorses the promoter's strategy and confirms project viability, which in turn incentivizes and provides the comfort for other investors to join. And second, the EIB factors into its analysis the positive externalities of the projects in the medium and long term. So for instance, longer term effects of innovation or CO2 emissions avoided. This allows us to offer longer financing tenors that are adapted to the best possible extent to the useful economic life of the projects. Now, what we also do is we partner with national institutions, both commercial banks and Banco Português de Fomento, so the national promotional banks and regional promotional banks where they exist, to support SMEs and other priority objectives. Let me cite a recent example, which is the financing of a 400 million investment program for elderly care infrastructure in Portugal, together with IFD, so the predecessor institution of Banco Português de Fomento. Our offer ranges from different types of advisory and technical assistance meant to improve project preparation, over equity and venture debt as startup and growth finance, to different forms of debt financing, project finance, structured finance solutions, and guarantees. Under mandates and in very close collaboration with the European Commission, under mandates, we target specific suboptimal investment situations. And I just mentioned the Innofin program or the FC, the so-called Juncker plan, and forthcoming also InvestEU. Now these target innovation, for instance, climate investments, etc. And the EIB has ample experience in blending funds from different sources. That can be funds from the European Union or member states. And these structures usually create a higher impact for the end beneficiaries compared to what could be achieved with the direct use of grants. Now, the most recent example of how the EIB has adapted flexibly and swiftly to a particular demand situation has been the catalogue of actions set up in response to the COVID pandemic. Last year, when the pandemic erupted, we adapted our existing SME financing instruments very quickly to make them accessible more immediately and more widely. We also facilitated financing to the health sector by including exceptionally certain operating expenses as eligible costs for the EIB loan. And in the area of my responsibility, we also set up a dedicated program loan to finance investment and expenditures in the health sector in Portugal and Spain. All these measures were accompanied by an accelerated approval process. And following a mandate by the EU member states, the bank set up a nearly 25 billion European Guarantee Fund, which is currently being implemented and was designed to catalyze total financing of up to 200 million. Last year in Portugal, EIB Group signed 27 transactions for a total of 2.3 billion. And I must say this volume of activity was particularly strong and significantly higher than what we had achieved in the years before. Of these 27 operations, 10 for a total of 1.3 billion related to COVID-19. This was nearly 60% of our annual activity and situated Portugal as the fourth beneficiary of COVID-related financing of the bank. So a very notable and salient result. Among the operations financed, let me just mention one example, 340 million to then still IFD, now Banco Portuguese de Fomento, and two novel securitization transactions, one with Santander Group for 587 million and one with Montepio for 275 million, that both ensured continued liquidity support to Portuguese companies. We are also, and I'm very glad to anticipate that, currently in the appraisal process for 3 guarantees under the European Guarantee Fund, notably including one with CGD and one with Banco Português de Fomento. Supporting the going concern of SMEs and mid-caps during the current crisis and beyond is vital to mitigate the systemic impact, maintain employment, and create the necessary conditions for future growth. Now, while the crisis has obviously been the obvious and necessary focus of demand for EIB financing over the past year, including in Portugal, we have not left and will not leave other areas of support unattended. Going forward, it is not only a question of overcoming the crisis, but also to do it well by setting the basis for a sustained, sustainable, cohesive and inclusive growth in the medium and longer term. For this reason, the bank has formulated its ambition to become a reference in the fight against climate change. Our new energy lending policy clearly sets the path towards full Paris alignment of all our activities from the beginning of this year onwards, the complete abandoning of the financing of fossil fuels from next year onwards, and an overall increase over time of the share of our climate and environment related activities to half of our annual business by 2025. Under this reinforced objective, EIB will enhance its support to renewable energy generation, energy networks, innovation in alternative fuels such as green hydrogen, energy efficiency, renewable energy technologies and energy storage, the electric vehicle and its value chain, and sustainable transport more widely. Just giving you some examples from Portugal, for instance, in 2020, we provided a 65 million loan to a project finance promoted by EDP Renováveis for the construction and operation of 2 onshore wind farms in Portugal. We also financed the modernization of the electricity network in Madeira with a loan of also 65 million to Empresa de Electricidade de Madeira. We also financed the construction and operation of a new biomass boiler for the Navigator company. Part of our new climate bank focus is also the protection and efficient use and reuse of our natural resources. And we have several recent examples also of such projects in Portugal, with loans to Águas do Interior Norte and Águas de Portugal Group. The greening of our activities going forward, which will be done in alignment with the EU taxonomy, will go hand in hand with a focus on digitalization, cohesion, and social inclusion. In this, our objectives are aligned with those of the National Recovery and Resilience Plans, and necessary investments will permeate all economic segments and concern public as well as private promoters. Now, we have heard from the investment survey that private companies' priorities center around the need to change products and services, to adapt their supply chains, and to upgrade their digitalization. This requires continuous investment and innovation, and as EIB, we expect to play a role in addressing the financing gaps caused by the pandemic, as well as more structural ones. On the public sector side, we heard that a majority of municipalities report investment gaps mostly in climate change mitigation and adaptation, digital infrastructure, and urban transport. We have very good examples in Portugal how EIB can support such investment, for instance, through a long-term loan to the city of Lisbon for its multi-annual investment plan into urban regeneration infrastructure, flood alleviation and prevention, social housing, and digital economy in startup clusters, where the 30-year tenor of the EIB financing and the favorable terms help to smoothen the annual debt burden, which in turn reverts to the ultimate benefit of the citizens of Lisbon. A second example is the financing of the upgrading of water and wastewater infrastructure by Banco de Portugal. Part of the overall financing approved by the EIB was implemented as a purchase of municipal credits from ADP. This was a very innovative monetization tool for the municipalities that resulted in an improved investment capacity that in turn can be used for other necessary municipal projects. Now, I close with in 2021, this year and beyond, we will continue to identify the best possible support that EIB can provide to the Portuguese economy in its role as the EU bank. And I very much look forward now to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beert, and thank you very much for the elements that you brought already to the panel. I would now switch to Dr. Macedo, and maybe in your intervention, you could try to discuss clearly from the financial sector side, but also looking at the situation of the corporate sector, which is in the course of the crisis, one of the risks that we see is also related to leverage of firms and the risk that this may have for the future. So maybe I leave it to you for your first introduction, but if you could touch on access to finance, SME, and the issue of leverage of corporate, and how you see from the financial sector side. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, dear Governor, dear Commissioner, dear Professor Maureen Felix, Chair, colleagues from the panel, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the invitation, for having me. I would address, as mentioned by the Chair, one first set of questions related to the impact of the COVID in Portugal and in the economy and in the firms, and otherwise on the banking side. And then I would go to the opportunities that we see in the digital, in green, and in investment. I would share a presentation with you, some brief slides that I'll introduce. So when we are speaking about what economic challenges we have in Portugal in the context of the COVID, of course, the main challenge is the duration and the end of the pandemics. How to face and everything in the economy, or a lot of it at least, is related with this. But if we go just to the economic part, what are the main challenges? What we see is the main challenge on the beginning of the pandemics was the maintenance of the economic tissue, to assure that the productive capacity would not go to levels that we could not recover. This was important that the monetary policy and that the banks gave to corporates, in general, to all firms and corporates and SMEs, the lowest financial costs in a lifetime. And I think a lot of times people and managers of companies don't understand this. This is the lowest financial costs of a lifetime of people that are in front, that manage companies. It was also important, and the challenge, what kind of state support, the guarantees and the layoff policies were decisive. The other challenge, of course, is the end of moratorias. For certain countries, it was not a big concern. For instance, like Germany, that have made all the program mainly in terms of guarantees, but for other countries like Italy or Portugal, the duration of moratorias and the way we are leaving the end of the moratorias is quite a challenge. And of course, as I mentioned before, the duration of the pandemics. So this for the economy. The second challenge is how to revamp the investment. We saw that Portugal decreased not very significantly the investment, but what we know is that the investment was at a low level. So we need clearly to revamp this investment. And besides the investment in construction, that always leads the global figure, we need, as it was mentioned, other kind of investment in RD and in green and so on. The other challenge that we have, and that was already mentioned, is the execution of the programs that we have in terms of guarantees. And it was described the lot of opportunities that the IEB put at disposal of the countries. For instance, Caixa Geral de Depósitos has already made around 2 billion euros in programs that already execute during these last 3 or 4 years. And now at this time we are asking for more support, and the support have been coming. So this was important because we don't only dispose to firms the guarantees programs by the Portuguese government, but we also had these guarantees programs with the IEB. And of course, the most important will be the execution of the recovery and resilience program because of the size, 45 billion euros. And this is the main challenge in terms for government policy, but also for firms. How to see that the right firms, the right projects have access to this huge funding, and this is one of the main challenges for the Portuguese societies and for entrepreneurs. Also, one of the challenges with the impact in the economy and the impact in SMEs, in firms in general, is how the financial system will leave the crisis. Mainly after the end of moratorias, and until now, the financial system in Portugal show some robustness and show some resilience. But what the big challenge is what will happen after the end of moratorias, what will happen in terms of the end of this year and the beginning of this year. So one of the things that is decisive for the Portuguese economy, for banks, but most of all, as Berto was mentioning, is what is the challenges for firms. That firms that don't have cash flows will have support to leave the moratorias. Like, for instance, of course, the tourism sectors, travel agencies, and other sectors that we all know. Another challenge that I think was successful was to keeping the European Union policy aligned with fiscal policy. And we know that in the past didn't happen. And we benefit clearly from an impressive and rapid intervention from the European level, but also at the government level. And this is a thing that haven't passed in the last crisis, as we all know. Not only in terms of timing, but also in terms of alignment. This time, fortunately, it was very different, and that's why a lot of countries, and Portugal also, could maintain the productive capacity in spite of the troubles that several companies has. The other challenge is the capitalization of firms, because with all these guarantees, with all these loans, with all this transmission from banks to firms of the monetary policy, the question is if we are just adding debt to debt, and how we are going to balance that with instruments like was mentioned in the survey that IAB referred, like for instance, instruments of quasi-capital. And this clearly is a challenge. The first mode was a mode of surviving, and this was to give liquidity, but now we need to also capital. And after the crisis, we will have a different, higher sectorial asymmetry with firms from sectors with very different behaviors. For banks, this in economic terms, for banks had previously a low economic environment of interest rates. Also, this was simultaneously hit with a low economic growth. We had a 7.6 GDP negative growth in 2020, as the governor said, lower than it was expected, but nevertheless the highest of the history of the last 50 years. We have this downturn impact in terms of, again, an increase of NPLs, and in case of Portugal, with the end of the moratorias, we need to assure that the right firms will be supported in order to not have a tsunami of NPLs. But in spite of the supports that will be made to firms, for the next years, we will have a stagnation of banking income in Europe, because we will have a decrease in net interest margin, with the decrease in terms of spreads and in terms of indexation. But and so the question is for 2 or 3 years, and it was mentioned before that some countries will come back to the figures of 2019 for instance, in 2022. I believe that Portugal will only come in 2023, and that would be not negative for our country, and sure for banks. Banks will not return to the ROEs of 2019 before 2023, and especially the case of Caixa. Positive effects and positive response to the challenge for the banking sector is that the banking sector this time was a part of the solution, not like the previous crisis where the financial sector had a big role in the crisis, and as also a problem in terms of cutting of funding and lack of capital and liquidity. This time banks were prepared with capital, with liquidity, and made part of the solution and not made a part. This is one of the other points that I would like to stress compared with the previous crisis. And I think this, all the firms and the corporates and SMEs benefit a lot compared with the previous crisis. But banks must be very clear that banks in Portugal will have a new wave of balance and P&L cleaning. We have done the cleaning of P&L, the cleaning of the balance sheet previously, mainly with the INPLs. Nowadays, we still have some significant figures in terms of INPLs, but when we compare the INPLs covered by impairments, they are almost in average with the rest of Europe. But in absolute terms, in gross terms, they are higher. But what is important to stress is that banks must be prepared to do another cleaning of the balance sheet. They have done it previously, and they need to, again. And the cleaning, of course, also in terms of the P&L, because costs must be revisited, because net interest margins will continue to fall, and the repricing that will be done by banks to firms will be on a downside side. The perspectives for ROE, of course, because of higher NPLs and lower net interest margins, of course, the provisions are low ROEs. What we need to do is to tackle again the inefficiency costs that banking have, clearly to take the opportunity of the digital, and this clearly the digital will be an opportunity in terms of client service, in terms of inclusion, but also in terms of the profitability of the banks. I would say that non-bank can be profitable if it doesn't decrease substantially the cost of serve clients, and doesn't get better the journey of the client. And of course, it will be difficult during these years to pay the cost of capital. As it was mentioned in some studies, more than 70% of the banks in Europe don't pay the cost of capital that was invested. And I think this is a theme that banks have to have on the agenda, and central banks have to have on their agenda, because if not, they don't pay. Of course, they will get investors. They will not attract investors. And some studies. This is a projection for the banking revenues for 2019 to 2025. What we see is in Portugal, the recovery for the levels of 2019 will be more or less, as I mentioned, in 2023 and not before that. Also, this will mean that the Portuguese banks and the European banks, and this slide is a slide that illustrates the challenge for European banks, is that previously to the COVID crisis in 2019, we had a significant part of banks in Europe that would thrive in terms of performance, because they would have capital and they would have a return on equity higher than 8%. What we see now is that the amount of banks with these circumstances after the COVID decreased to a quarter. And the most part of the European banks will be what this consultant called the limbo, where banks have capital but don't have enough profitability. So this is clearly a challenge, and banks, for all the reasons, must face the opportunities that there are on the market, and there are some, to face their own structural problems in terms of going forward. To end this part, just a brief word in terms of what was the reaction to crisis. The first reaction clearly was a first survival mode. It was to react. It was to give liquidity to firms. It was to lay off employees. It was to give security measures to attend clients. And I think the banking in Europe has a very important role, because, for instance, in Portugal, 99% of the branches were open for 100% of the time during all the crisis. And so none of the firms of households had any disruption in terms of services, and I think that happened also in the rest of Europe, and I think that is important. In a crucial part, in a crucial time, banking was there to support families, to support SMEs, and so on. And as I mentioned, the other important reaction to crisis was the faster and coordinated monetary and fiscal policies at the short and medium term. What was important also is that this policy and this cut in interest rates and this acquisition program that has impact on the short and medium term was coordinated with the European Union in terms of the resilience and recovery programs for all the European countries. And so we had a combination of measures for the short and the medium term, and important measures in terms of the long term. And this, in my view, was decisive, not only to not have a bigger decrease in the GDP in Europe, but also to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Of course, and I think this is very positive. Of course, if we look for the last provisions of ECD, that was published in the Financial Times last week, what we see is Europe is the sixth area that will grow less. So the only ones that will grow less than we are Japan. And so this is quite challenging because EU took measures, took adequate measures. What happened is other countries took a different set of measures and have, of course, different impacts in their economies. Also, in terms of the reaction to the crisis, we have to stress that the growth of debt is there and that firms need to have time, need to some extension of maturities, need to some support for the programs of state, but also in terms of the banks to allow the extension of maturities, and I think banks will respond positively to that. Also, we have severe asymmetric behavior in terms of liquidity. We have all kind of economic agents that have increase their savings, and that the deposits in banks and the excess of liquidity affects all the banks, and it affects, or the most part of the banks, and it is transversal to SMEs, to corporates, to institutionals, to big institutions, to households, but in a very asymmetric way, because of course there are also firms that have some constraints to financing. And so this asymmetry, I would say, is even higher than before the crisis. In terms of opportunity and leaving the first phase, then the challenges and the reactions, and go to the transformation and what we can see in terms of the green, what we can see in terms of the digitalization. We see clearly an opportunity for transformation and a necessity for transformation. It is not just only an opportunity, it's clear a necessity. If we want to do better business, if we want to attack our structural deficiencies, and I'm talking about banks, clearly the digitalization is a no-brainer. It is not a question of we go on that or not, but how we will do it. Of course, also the other point that accelerate, for instance, Caixa with the Caixa Geral de Depósitos, as other banks, evolved the underwriting of the credit at home. Evolved 100% of his call center was done at home. And so the virtualization of the workforce was clearly a reality that not only happens today as we are speaking. Our credit departments are at home. Our central services, 90% are at home. And a part of our commercial staff is also at home. The other part is on the branches, giving support to households and firms. And of course, we had a focus on safety and surveillance that we didn't have before. In this, we can also refer the cyber attacks that grew substantially, and so there are not only positive opportunities. Of course, in general, the society and especially banks have to deal with the cyber attacks. In terms of what banks have done and what we face, when you usually say that the crisis was an accelerator, but what people don't usually see is that we pass for more than 50% of the transactions. 50% of the transactions, they are by a digital. They are digital, and this 50% increase was in the space of 10 months. And so this is clearly what we have is the digital channels account, for instance, in Caixa of 71% of the transactions, and ATMs and branches transactions are less than 30%, which is quite a change, and it is quite important. Also in terms of business, consumer loans and other business done by internet have developed significantly. when we see what we can do in terms of the sustainable finance and the ECG, clearly we have spoke mainly about green, but as we all know, the ECG, environment, but also social and governance. And I think these points are very important with during these pandemics. I think several companies, firms, and also the banks had the opportunity to concentrate themselves in equality gender programs, in financing green financing in better conditions, and also to take advantages as a cost reduction, but also as redesigning products to meet environment standards. For instance, in Caixa Geral de Depósitos, we had a 36% decrease in the consumption of electricity, in 39% in water, 90% decrease in paper, and 30% decrease in occupied area in terms of square meters. And this during these 4 years. So we have several measures. One important point is that in terms of our investment fund companies and the investment funds that we put at disposal to our clients, we pass from securities investment funds with integration of SG criteria from 160 million to 4 billion euros from 2019 to 2020. So to finish, I would say that we see some light at the end of the tunnel. Of course, the end of the tunnel will be with the end of pandemics, or at least with the end of shutdown and with the control. And for the end of shutdown and the control of the pandemics, we need herd immunity that some countries are targeting, and that is clearly a hope for all of us. We need to design support measures to specific sectors without cash flow. We cannot end moratorias without supporting firms from not only from tourism and travel agencies, but also from culture areas, from education areas that suffered a lot. We need to put a significant effort in the success of the recovery and resilience plan. For instance, I would say that one of the things that the managers of these funds could learn is to have a fit and proper, like for instance, that exists in the banking side. So I think that should be very demanding, should be very high profile in order to get success. And in terms of the investment, I think there are, the impediments were already mentioned, some uncertainty about the lockdown and where it finish or not. The level of recovery is if the demand is there, if the consumption comes back, if there is safe to travel. But one good news, as it was mentioned in the IIB survey, is that we don't have major constraints in the short term. When we look to Portugal, what we see in terms of financing constraints over time is that we clearly decrease the finance constraints to around 1/3 that what happened in 2016, and so we compare very well with the European Union and with the US. We need to, for that access to funds, we need to treat the problem of lack of own funds in the medium and long terms in firms, and this is an issue that we need to address, and also the skills gap. We don't speak a lot in terms of the skills gap during the pandemics, but what we see in the survey of last year of the World Economic Forum is that in 9 barriers to investment and to success, 5 of them were related to skills. Skills from labor force, but also skills from management. And I think this is quite a challenge, and I think during the pandemics, at least Caixa Geral de Depósitos is doing some more training, even if it is not presential, and is doing training for the top management, for the middle management, and for the account managers. So I think we have a lot of doubts, but clearly in our view, the winter is ending. The question is if it's time for spring or not. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, and I think it has been a very informative presentation. I take a few elements I just wanted to remark out of what you were saying. First of all, that at this time the financial sector was a part of the solution. That's a very important element, and I think going forward, as you say, it has also to be a sector fast in new cleaning up whenever it will come in order to continue to be a driver for this recovery. Then the element on asymmetries in the recovery among sectors and among firms, and the need to make sure that the policy support goes toward the right firms and allowing them to transform. And I think this keeping incentive for firms transformation going forward is more and more important. And the last element the last two elements, the issue of the leverage, and if you want also find ways for having equity type of instruments with the right incentive for the firms to try to recapitalize the firms, because the leverage story is not a problem of today, it's a problem of the last years. It's not only crisis related, it's a long-lasting problem in the Portuguese economy. And the last point where I would like then later as to come back is the issues in terms of skills. Also for our analysis, it's extremely important. The skill issues is also an important link with the inclusion story and the inclusion, how to deal with the digital and green transition in an inclusive way. And skills become incredibly important in this direction. So that's something that we will pick up later. But then at this moment, I would like to switch then to the next speaker, Paula Guerra, that is a group head of finance for ADP. And I think the idea is really to switch toward the climate transition and try to see how the crisis affected the incentive to move forward with the climate transition in Portugal, both on the corporate incentive side and the green financing side, and also thinking at what is blocking this transformation of the Portuguese economy.
Okay, thank you very much, Deborah, and thank you to the EIB and also Bank of Portugal for having us. Apologies on behalf of CFOs of EDP, Rui Teixeira, who was unfortunately not able to join, but I'll try to fill in his shoes and convey a view from the corporate side, in particular corporate that is focused on energy transition. First of all, just a few words of context. I'll try not to repeat what has already been said, but put it in the context of the electricity sector. So clearly 2020 was marked by the global development of the pandemic, and this had a dramatic impact on the economy with the shutdown of many activities due specifically to lockdown measures. And of course, the electricity sector was not immune to this. So we saw in Portugal that while the Portuguese economy contracted by 7.6% during the year, electricity consumption declined by 3% during the year. And if we look and zoom in at the second quarter of the year, demand destruction in terms of electricity consumption was 11%. If we further zoom in terms of sectors, we see that the most impacted sector or segment was actually the special low voltage and medium voltage with a drop of about 8%. And this is no wonder because about 40% of this segment is made of SMEs. So we see the dramatic impact that the pandemic had in the economic tissue and in SMEs in Portugal. Contrary to this, actual residential sector slightly increased. Now, it has already been stated that we've seen European Union and government authorities throughout acting very quickly with short-term measures, full alignment between fiscal and monetary policies, and I fully agree with my fellow panelists that this was a very different approach from the previous crisis, so huge lessons learned, thankfully. And specifically in the electricity sector, what we saw was the application of suspension on electricity and energy cuts, and also the widening of the social tariff. So all to maintain families and the social tissue and economic tissue working at the minimum and trying not to be more disruptive than we're already being. Now, what the pandemic also brought was a demonstration through the reduced levels of pollution of the need and the scale of change that is needed to decline or to eliminate the damaging effects on climate change. We've also heard several of the participants talk about the stimulus packages that have been implemented all over the world, in particular in Europe, with the 1.8 trillion packages that have been announced. And these have, rightly in our view, been focused very much on renewable energy sources, on energy efficiency, on low carbon technologies, and on digitalization. Now, specifically talking about the digitalization of the economy and in more specific terms of the energy sector, this is not a new trend. Okay, this was already taking place before the pandemic, and if anything, the necessity of it actually made it accelerate during 2020, given the restrictions that we were all imposed. Now, specifically in terms of the electricity sector, what this digitalization is aiming to do is change the paradigm towards a smarter and more decentralized system where consumers actually have an increasingly active role and are focused on energy efficiency as well. So it's not just about utilities, it's also about consumers and their role and their saying in the prospects. Now, something that has also been said is that it's not just about policies, these are keys, but we need to have alignment. And we need to have alignment between EU authorities and how each member country actually applies these programs, and how successful each country is in capturing private investments. And this will very much depend on the relative competitive advantages that each one is able to show, both in terms of regulation, political stability, and, well, essentially how investment friendly each country is. Now, this involves the alignment between EU, member states, European Central Bank, all of the local central banks that we have, and ensuring that predictable legal and regulatory framework does indeed exist, so that private sector has the necessary confidence and trust to take long-term decisions. Last but not least, certainly the economy needs robust corporates promoting these long-term investments. And this is the only way to drive long-term sustainable growth and jobs creation. And being part of EDP as the largest corporate headquartered in Portugal with a footprint in over 20 countries, we take on this responsibility very seriously. So we as utility provide essential services, and we recognize that we play a key role both in the short term, in mitigating the short-term impacts of the pandemic, but also in enabling the economic recovery for the longer term. Now, again, sustainability is not a new item for EDP. This has been on our strategic agenda for quite some time, and we have been focused for many years, well over a decade, in decarbonization of the economy and certainly of the energy sector. I just said that we're present in over 20 countries. So in fact, although about 60% of EDP's EBITDA today is actually coming from outside Portugal, we still keep a very strong commitment to the country, and we actively support all of our stakeholders, and we have supported them very specifically at the beginning of the crisis, of the pandemic crisis last year. I can name a few examples, very clear, of what we did back in March, April, so the second most critical quarter of the pandemic in 2020. In terms of our employees, 100% of the jobs were maintained, and remote working became widespread, of course, with the exception of those that have to work on the field, be it on the generation power plants or on the network. We supported our suppliers, so we recognized early on that it was essentially to maintain economic activity and employment, and we anticipated roughly 150 million of payments during the two most critical months of the beginning of the pandemic, just to make sure that those that did not have immediate access to liquidity kept on their productivity, their production without a disruption. Thirdly, our clients. So EDP not only put into practice the law in terms of not making cuts, but we also went a step further and managed and offered more flexible payment deadlines, more digital contact means and call centers, and also a greater focus on digital payments. So all of that, different ways of supporting our clients. Another pillar, communities. This has been a very, very important part of EDP's strategy and focus for a long time. And during the first stages of the pandemic, we donated about 5 million euros of medical equipment. This is alone for Portugal. Over 500,000 euros in donations to social institutions, 3,000 laptops to schools as well, and also additional electricity discounts to over 700,000 health professionals and over 500 institutions. Again, this is focused only in Portugal. Last but not least, among our stakeholders, our shareholders. Dividends payment is an important part of EDP's strategy, and it has been the way that EDP has maintained the attraction to its capital. So we continue to pursue the execution of our business plan and pay the dividend according to what had been devised in our plan. Now, going forward, these were short-term, these were immediate measures. What's next? Well, basically, we have announced late February our strategic update going all the way until 2025. And what we have announced to the market is a step up in the challenge to maintain our leadership position in the energy transition. And that consists essentially of a 24 billion euro investment plan, focused majority, I'd say 85% in renewables addition, but also about 15% of it in networks. So making sure that those networks are more and more digital, more resilient, and are able to support this energy transition properly. And last but not least, about 5% in client solutions in energy management. So including a technology such as the solar distributed generation, e-mobility, and beginning, although in a small sense, of looking at hydrogen as, in our view, a source of storing energy, a new way of storing energy. Now, how about Portugal? How does Portugal play into factoring this business plan? Certainly, it has been an important sector for us, an important country for us, and it continues to be. So for the next 5 years, we're going to dedicate about 6 billion euros to investments in people and suppliers and the community, focused, of course, on the transformation of the country's energy mix, to reduce Portugal's dependence from about 77% that we had in 18 to hopefully what will be about 65% by 2030. This is according to APRAN. We're going to focus on decarbonization of higher carbon intensive sectors such as chemicals and cement. We will try to lead our clients into the energy transition. So using less carbon intensive technologies, as well as creating more efficient habits of energy consumption. That is also an important part. And we will continue to try and set Portugal as an innovation platform in the sector. So supporting startups that have direct links to energy innovation. And last but not least, as I said, making sure that we have a resilient and efficient electricity network, because this is truly the backbone of the country's development, in our view. With all of this, the plan is to try and contribute to the creation of over 7,000 new jobs, both directly and indirectly, and in figures that have more to do with metrics of energy transition, target 1.4 million tons of CO2 avoided emissions per year by 2025. So this in a nutshell in terms of small, short-term and medium long-term. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think it was a very informative and very interesting discussion on what is happening short-term and long-term in terms of the climate transition in Portugal. And I fully take from what you say the importance of something that we see also in our survey. In the moment in which firms tell us that the major impediment is still uncertainty or regulation and taxation. So this element on how this clarity scales down from the global policy decisions to the European policy decision, and then they get scaled down on the operationals for the private sector. This is incredibly important. And on the other side, I think another element, two other elements that we see important are on the one side that when firms and particularly SME try to think about their climate investment, on the one side is the regulation and uncertainty, but on the other side also information and skills matter. And skills can come from management level to employee level, but the information element and the skills element is also important. And I think I remain with these two elements, the importance of the complementarity public-private, the clarity of the direction, and the importance of information and skills. I would move then to the last panelist, Elena Adegas, that is from Banco de Portugal's head of market department. And she will also look at, again, at the topic of the climate transition, also looking at how the financial sector and how now the greening of the financial sector is happening, and what is the process on that side. Elena, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am trying to share my slides. Let me see how it goes. Are you able to see them now?
Yes, yes, perfect.
Okay, so we have been seeing here many perspectives on this fight against climate change. We have the example of many stakeholders and well, the European Commission, the financial markets represented here by the EIB, the Caixa Geral de Deposits in their role channeling funds from to the right projects. We have heard the position of a company like the EDP. Now I'm going to give the position, the perspective of a central bank, what a central bank can do in this respect. But central banks have many hats, many roles, and I'm going to narrow my scope a little bit, because a central bank can act as any company in its internal management, or as a regulator or a supervision in trying to influence the way banks act in this respect, or as a monetary institution, monetary authority in the way it designs and implements monetary policy. But I'm going to focus on the fourth role of central banks as investors, in the way they invest their non-monetary policy portfolios. In this respect, I will start by talking about the roles, discussing the goals, the strategies and difficulties, the importance of international cooperation, the impact of COVID crisis, which has already been discussed by previous speakers, and finally the contribution of Banco de Portugal. Central bank reserves have been increasing globally, and this gives them the power to influence the markets and the flow of financing. More than that, central banks can set the example and have a catalyst role. A recent example in the Euro system was the announcement in the beginning of February by the ECB and 19 national central banks of the decision to voluntarily join forces and adopt a common framework in the management of their non-monetary policy portfolios in what concerns climate change. When we think about green and sustainable investments, there are two possible stances, and they are not mutually exclusive. One is more defensive. If we think about protection from the negative effect of the physical risks, the so-called green swans, or mispricing, the adjustment of mispricings between what is green and what is brown. But that is a defensive approach. Then we have a more proactive approach that means financing the energy transition. And that can even, instead of reducing risks, it can bring more risk, because it implies helping projects that potentially are more risky, but that can turn into a clean energy breakthrough if they go right. So we have these two perspectives. Another question is which strategies to follow. How can we better contribute to a greener world? Is it by excluding brown assets from our portfolio? Or is it by financing green projects of brown companies? Or is it by influencing the behavior of the company? It's not easy to see that there are clearly different strategies, from the more basic ones to more influencing ones, let's say, and some are more powerful than others. This brings me to the type of instruments. It's another topic. The most common are green bonds. That's what we talk about most of the time. In green bonds, and as everybody knows, the proceeds are earmarked to finance environmentally friendly investments. But it can raise concerns of greenwashing, because a brown company can issue green bonds. On the other side, a brown company may be making real efforts to move to net zero by, let's say, 2050. So in that case, it should be supported. A dynamic approach is needed. And in this respect, now I noticed that maybe you are not seeing the whole of my slides. In that respect, sustainability-linked bonds are an interesting new instrument because they are linked to the issuer's performance in terms of KPI that must meet predefined targets. So the use of proceeds is not restricted like in green bonds. They are a forward-looking performance-based instrument that has been, it's still in the beginning, but has received an important boost by the ECB support in the end of 2020 when these instruments were included in the monetary policy framework. Well, besides investing, what can central banks do? Well, they can do a lot. They can help the further development of the green bond market. And this requires improvements in standards, in disclosures, the need to have clarity as to what is green and what is brown, and to have commonly accepted methodologies and taxonomy, and reliable data. And central banks can help by setting the example and pressing the market in this direction. There are multiple voluntary reporting standards, but they are converging desirably to a single one, universally accepted. And we are progressing from a voluntary basis to generalized use. And in this respect, international cooperation is very important. There are lots of initiatives going on. I'm just mentioning 3 examples: the NGFS, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and all the EU initiatives. And there is coming up regulation on many respects, on taxonomy, on disclosures, on benchmarks. And this is really fundamental to attract demand by investors. And jumping from demand to supply, it's remarkable the impact of the COVID crisis on the supply side. Both the SURE and the NGEU funds will impact the issuance of social and green bonds, and this will cement the leading role of the EU as an issuer, and the role of the euro as preferred currency, and will help create a benchmark for liquid and safe green assets. And I will finish with the Bank of Portugal's contribution in this respect. We have started in 2017 with the investment in an investment fund in corporate bonds, ESG. Then in 2019, we continued by investing in a BIS Green Fund in dollars and by including sustainability principles in the investment guidelines. Then in 2019 and 2020, we started investing in green bonds. Already this year, in 2021, we invested in the BIS Green Fund in euro. And the next steps will be possibly to create a green bond dedicated portfolio and to the publication of a socially responsible investment charter. And I would end with 3 takeaways very quickly. Just climate change cannot be ignored, and central banks have an important role to play. As investors, they should contribute to the green bond market development and to a better allocation of financial resources towards sustainable projects. And Banco de Portugal is aware of this responsibility and has been increasingly contributing to this objective. Thank you. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much. I think we have a clear reminder that there is a very strong effort from a central bank to be decisive actors in the process of the green transition, and we see the effort on Banco de Portugal, but also the ECB and other central banks that are actually moving quite forcefully in this direction. And the other thing I wanted to mention is when you were talking about the green bonds, we also as EIB have quite a strong role in this direction, being the first issuer of really denominated green bonds among the international institutions. With that, I see the time is really short. I would call if there is any question, and if people wanted to raise a question in the chat. If I don't see any questions, then my main point is actually going back maybe with one sentence to each of the panelists, thinking about the issue of skills that we have been talking about, and seeing on the various areas that we are discussing on your own specific area of competence. Where do you see the link between skills, digitalization, the climate transition, and the role of policy priority to push for this reskilling needed? I would ask each one of you to use really 1 minute for just an idea or proposal to put on the table. And I don't know, maybe we can start again with Birte.
Apologies, Deborah. Could you please repeat your question?
On the skills side, we see that the skills are very much at the basis of the constraints for investment, both on digital and skills, and what can be done on a policy point of view. On 1 minute, just one idea that you may have.
Yeah. I mean, they're different. What is important from the EIB side? And we do have and continue to develop several programs in support of education and skills. That can be vocational programs. We have done this in Spain. University education, obviously, and education and infrastructure more generally. And this also, by the way, combined with climate-related aspects when those infrastructure building is energy efficient, for instance. So what we are seeing also is more kind of crossover meeting of objectives through several policy fields, and we obviously act where the demand is, and that is we cannot create the demand ourselves, and we do not create policies, but we detect and follow those investment gaps and financing gaps that present themselves to us at each moment in time.
Thank you very much. And on the bank side, Dr. Macedo, where would you see the needs of reskilling, mostly for the digital and green transition?
We clearly view a significant need in terms of reskilling, in the different areas, because I would say that all major areas of the banking sector have been eaten by change. The first one in terms of underwriting of risk, and that was previous to this crisis. Also in terms of compliance and governance, the attitudes, the requirements are totally different. We have to do a total reskill, for instance, for our audit people. We have to reskill, as you know, our functions of control. And I would say that in terms of the digital, we see it in a more easier way than what we thought. Also, there is a significant effort to digital inclusion outside Caixa, but also inside Caixa. And I think this is one of the main objectives and would be one of the main goals to the banks, that is to provide with the digital inclusion, which must start at their own at home. But I would say in terms of green, what I think people need more is to be opportunity chasers, to know what is the role in terms of the redirecting the investment and the right financing to the net positive sides of the economy. So clearly I see a need to learn in the various areas of the banking sector.
Thank you very much. And Paula Guerra?
Deborah, thank you very much. Look, in terms of a utility like EDP, as I said, digitalization has been at our core for a very long time, and training skills in terms of digital stretch out throughout the entire corporation. I think the new challenge is to incorporate also the concept of sustainability going beyond what is more obvious, which is the technology, which is renewables, which is what we're famous for, wind and solar, but also stretching to all areas of the group and focusing on all of the ESG vectors, which is environment, social and governance. And this training is also taking place. So we have training in terms of ethics, in terms of sustainable investment, of socially responsible behavior. And I think this is, having been part of the DNA of EDP for a long time, it must be ensured that this culture prevails with the renovation of people and the new people coming on board to the team, so that the culture is maintained and reinforced within this digital and sustainable set of skills and mindset.
Thank you very much. And Elena?
Yes, in terms of skills, well, we are learning on the job. If we think about how we adapted to this teleworking situation, it's really surprising how people have been adapting and learning and getting digital skills. If the sample that we have here at the central bank is any representative of what we have in the country, it's very optimistic. It's very positive. But also in terms of skills, we can have the central bank can have an impact through on the outside the bank. And through some programs like the financial literacy program that we have. Of course, it's more focused to financial literacy, but can also help in terms of helping develop skills, digital skills. In terms of green, sustainable, sensitivity, it's something that it's going step by step. It's a process. Even internally, we are starting to have that process. It's also a communication effort that we have to make. And but I think the progress is very positive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think with that we are running out of time. So I would like to thank all the panelists for a very insightful discussion on the challenge going forward in the post-COVID and digital and green transition in Portugal, and I would like to pass the floor to Vice President Ricardo Mourinho for the closing keynote remark.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, perfectly. Sorry, I was muted myself.
Okay, so good evening. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for your participation. I'd like to start by thanking Governor Mário Centeno of Bank of Portugal for the very insightful words. I'd like to address Commissioner Madame Elisa Ferreira for his participation, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start to say that this is a great pleasure and an honor to address you in the closing remarks of this conference we co-organized with the Banco de Portugal on investment, digitalization, and green financing. I'd like to thank you, Mario, for the warm welcome, and I'd like to thank Bank of Portugal and the IB team for organizing this great event. Speaking at the conference organized by Bank of Portugal always makes me feel like coming home. Banco de Portugal is where I belong to, and it is always good to be back. In today's conference, we had the opening remarks by you, Mario, very inspiring and insightful as they are always. We had a great keynote speech by Elisa Ferreira. Thank you, Elisa. Very insightful and very clear messages, as usually, and a key guidance for us at the European Investment Bank. The European Investment Bank is the EU bank. We are fully committed to work with the Commission to target the EU policy goals, not only by our statute, but by our genetics. This is in our DNA. This is not an obligation. This is our reason to exist. Pedro de Lima, our head of research, presented an overview of our investment report. The investment report is the EIB main economic analysis document and assesses the state of investment in the EU and beyond on a yearly basis, providing guidance to our policy decisions. Our investment report is not based on pure theory. We learn from the data, from the reality. We learn from thousands of firms that report on their investment policies, expectations, barriers, difficulties, and challenges. This is even more important in the current challenging times we live in. We are in uncharted territory for more than a year now. We have the ambition to extend our investment survey to municipalities next year, and we'll start working on it soon, and I'm sure we can count with your support, Elisa, and of the Commission services. We need to think out of the box if we want to rise to the challenges. This is what EU citizens expect from us. from policymakers, from supervisors, from corporate managers, and from investment bankers. We deliver in these unprecedented times. Then, if we deliver, EU is delivering to EU citizens, and we will do it for EU citizens and for our kids, for the future of a united Europe. We had a panel discussion moderated by our chief economist, Deborah Revoltella, whom I deeply thank. And we had the opening remarks by Birte, our director for operations in Iberia. Birte and her team are doing a terrific job, and the same applies for the EIF. The activity of the IB Group in Portugal in 2020 reached the highest levels after the sovereign debt crisis. EIB is playing a clear counter-cyclical role in countries most affected by the crisis, as it should, and will continue to do so in 2021. This is unprecedented. Iberia was one of the most affected regions in the European Union. Iberian team worked magnificently. Iberia team delivered in 2020, and the robust pipeline for 2021 is already there, namely on the implementation of the European Guarantee Fund. And it was so hard to get it. Some of you know it, but we did it proudly. Long days and nights in April 2020 paid off. That was the time all the EU institutions raised to the situation and added 540 billion euros to the 750 billion put forward by the ECB. This time it was really, really different. The panel discussion brought together three key players in investment, digitalization, and green financing. Paulo Macedo is the CEO of CGD since 2017. He was responsible to implement a successful turnaround in Caixa Geral de Depósitos, the biggest Portuguese bank. Caixa Geral de Depósitos is a key partner of the IB in Portugal. We work together to extend financing to Portuguese firms, to support liquidity in the crisis, but also to foster investment in digitalization, in innovation, and in green transition. We did it before the crisis, we did it in the early days of the crisis, and we'll do it after the crisis to foster a robust recovery. Paulo's comments and views are very welcome, and we at the IB are aware of the challenges faced by the corporate sector, in particular in Portugal. We are working on financial and solvency support instruments. Viable firms are key to the recovery of our economies, and we must stand side by side with them to foster a quick, steady, and sustainable recovery. Paulo Guerra, head of EDP Finance Department, provided us a glimpse of future from the perspective of a key player in the energy sector in Portugal and well beyond. EDP is a key partner of the IB and will definitely be a key player in climate action in Iberia. Though not a surprise, it is very reassuring to hear from your strong commitment to contribute to a carbon neutral future for Portugal and to tackle challenges we face. The IB is fully committed to work with all energy sector partners to increase energy efficiency, to increase the incorporation of energy from renewable sources, to finance innovation and research in the energy production, notably in green hydrogen production, distribution, and utilization. The head of market department of Banco de Portugal, Helena Adegas, a reputed economist with an immense knowledge on portfolio management from a central bank perspective. Helena provides us key insights in the role of the central bank in the management of non-monetary policy portfolios. This is key, how to put non-monetary portfolios managed by central banks at the service of the green transition. Helena brought us very insightful views on how central banks are working together to contribute to the development of the green bond market. This is extremely important, even more in a period in which the ECB is also rethinking its monetary policy strategy and debating on how to consider climate challenges in its strategy in the remit of its mandate. And we know how tough this debate can get. I would like to thank all panelists for the very interesting and insightful discussion. Let me now turn into the present and the future from the EIB perspective. Let me invite you to some reflection on the role of our institutions. How do we see all of us working together to meet the EU policy goals on recovery, climate agenda, innovation, and digital transition, leaving no one behind? In the most strict respect, of course, for the independence of the central bank. We must never forget it. Needless to say that COVID-19 crisis is far from over. But the role of the EU in facing the COVID-19 crisis and its economic impacts from the outset was really unprecedented. EU put forward a massive policy support, not only monetary policy stimulus. This time it was different, much different, as Paulo Macedo clearly highlighted. We made it very different. EU supported, shielded financial stability, and credit kept flowing during this crisis. This simply prevented the sanitary crisis from turning into a full-blown financial crisis of unprecedented dimensions. But at times of significant uncertainty, private investment might be not enough to fill the gap created by the economic effects of this terrible pandemic. Against this background, monetary policy transmission cannot deploy its full impact by itself. That is why a fiscal expansion was indispensable to shelter demand and mitigate long-run impacts of the crisis. EU programs such as InvestEU and the Recovery and Resilience Plan are therefore crucial to put the recovery into action, to deliver to our citizens, to leave no one behind. The pandemic is still there, and its economic effects will last for long. They will last much longer than predicted in the outset of the crisis. The data is clear. Investment has contracted precipitously. And though the sanitary shock is exogenous, and one may even claim it is symmetric, the economic impact across regions and sectors is largely asymmetric. Economies with less fiscal space are being more affected than those with a better fiscal starting position. Services sectors that rely more on interpersonal relationships, confidence, and that are not storable by definition, are much more affected than the manufacturing sector. Pedro de Lima presented the main conclusions of the IB investment survey earlier today, and they are very clear. More than half of firms in Portugal and in the EU, we are very similar, expect to invest less in the near future. As a result, large parts of Europe could be left behind. This simply cannot happen. We must act now. Demand prospects and confidence are now the key restraints to investments. This time is not the lack of funding, because we made it differently. But many firms face a terrible dilemma. Should they underinvest to repair their balance sheets, risking their competitiveness and their economic viability? Or should they invest and over-leverage to innovate in a world full of uncertainty? This is a key problem for many European firms. This is a key problem for many Portuguese firms. Portuguese firms are still more leveraged than their EU counterparts are. And the COVID-19 pandemic simply interrupted their extremely important and extremely brave sound deleveraging process. I believe, however, that the consensus is emerging. I believe that the sustainable recovery depends on the implementation of policies that address our long-term challenges. We need to foster investment, the area of green and digital transition. This will be key for an economic recovery that builds back better for Portugal and for Europe. It is not just about rebuild the economy. That would not be easy either, but will not prepare us for the way ahead. We need to do much more. We need to accelerate investment to build a more sustainable economy. We need to promote the sustainable development goals. We need to engage in the digital transition. We need to deliver on the Paris Agreement and make Europe the first carbon neutral continent in the world by 2050. We are all aligned. Christine Lagarde, president of the ECB, said it loud and clear. I think that it is almost unanimous within the Governing Council that climate imperatives are nothing less than imperatives. This is a very strong statement, an imperative. The implementation of an inclusive, green and digital European recovery is the focus of our activity, while playing an important role in Europe's response to the COVID-19 crisis. The EIB has a privileged position to finance the transition. We are the most patient lender, hence we are able to provide financing to address the financing gaps caused by the pandemic, as well as structural ones, and wait patiently for returns in the far long future. We are able to share the risks of radical innovations. The IB provides targeted long-term finance to incentivize investment in the twin transition, to support long-term investment strategies, but with well-established implementation plans for the short and medium run. We play an important role in assessing the quality of public investment and in crowding in private sector investors. The Recovery and Resilience Fund is a key instrument at the heart of the Next Generation EU. It will play a crucial role in supporting the European recovery and will contribute to a more resilient economy and to a fair, green and digital transition. The Recovery and Resilience Fund will bring 670 billion in loans and grants available to support reforms and investment by member states. We are working together with the member states in the recovery and resilience plans and in its future implementation through advisory services and financial instruments. Financial instruments funded by Recovery and Resilience Fund, in particular through contributions to the InvestEU national compartments. But after such a prolonged crisis period, the corporate sector requires more than liquidity support. To overcome the terrible dilemma I referred above, equity and capital are key for companies to engage in a sustainable recovery. The implementation of solvency support instruments will play a key role in supporting viable companies and sectors more impacted by the pandemic. And this is even more important in member states in which solvency support thus far is limited or even non-existent. The IB Group, through equity funds, can have an important role in providing such instruments, maximizing the utilization of Recovery and Resilience funds to crowd in private investors. Over the last years, we launched several equity initiatives in Portugal, and we are prepared to do more. But besides equity instruments, we will support the recovery also through risk-sharing and guarantee instruments to cover principal losses in portfolios of SME loans resulting from the liquidity provision. In April 2020, the European Council endorsed the creation of the European Guarantee Fund. The fund is built on 24.5 billion euros in guarantees of member states, which are being used to mobilize approximately 200 billion euros of investment in the participating member states. There is a robust pipeline for Portugal under implementation with the main Portuguese banks, and we are prepared to do more. But to leave no one behind, the recovery needs to be fair. We need also a social agenda. Leaving no one behind is more than words. It is supporting and financing social infrastructures. We are financing new health and social infrastructures, but we are also backing companies in the healthcare and in the pharmaceutical sector. This also has a social dimension. In 2020, we provided BioNTech with 100 million euros of debt financing for the development of what became the first COVID-19 vaccine and for its manufacturing. We are financing 150 projects with 400 million euros to upgrade long-term and elderly care infrastructures across Portugal in a partnership with Banco Portuguese de Investimento. The provision of decent, safe and energy-efficient housing for lower-income population is also key to foster the quality of living of our citizens and to diffuse potential social tensions. EIB creates advanced finance tools to meet that needs. Social and affordable housing loans are a major element of our 150 billion euros in urban lending over the last 7 years to support the EU urban policy. As done successfully in many geographies, we'll work with the Portuguese government to improve the availability of rental housing targeting groups that are more vulnerable. It is true that COVID pandemic turned our attention to urgent issues of protecting our citizens from this terrible pandemic, in preserving economic functioning, jobs and living standards. The pandemic implied a large economic slump, but one cannot lose sight of the structural challenges we face ahead. Fight climate change, foster innovation, and promote digital transition. Moving towards a green, more inclusive economic model is the most imperative and urgent challenge of this century. It must be no less than imperative and urgent. Indeed, COVID-19 confirmed that going forward, a greener economy, rapid digitalization, and innovation as a whole is crucial. Digitalization is transforming business models and value chains. This, together with addressing climate change, must be a very powerful growth engine. Building back better for socioeconomic resilience requires climate neutrality and an improved public health response capacity, both supported by the latest in digital technology. The European Commission has classified climate change and environmental degradation as an existential threat to Europe and to the humankind. To overcome this, the European Commission launched the European Green Deal, a growth strategy to transform the European Union into a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy. An economy with zero net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050 that leaves no person or place behind. The IB is the EU Climate Bank and the largest finance provider for sustainable and environmental projects. Since the beginning of this year, we aligned our financing activities with the Paris Agreement goals. We'll allocate at least 50% of our funding for climate action and environmental sustainability by 2025. And we are committed to mobilize 1 trillion euros in climate action investments over the next decade. To reach these ambitious targets, the IB will support large-scale initiatives that contribute to the decarbonization of the economy, such as the development of the green hydrogen chain. Portugal has showed a high political will to pioneer green hydrogen, taking advantage of the large supply of renewable energy, namely solar and wind, to develop green hydrogen projects as an important pillar of the decarbonization of the economy. EIB is a key player supporting the development of renewables. We have financed 2 billion euros in hydrogen projects since 2010. We support infrastructure deployment and innovation across the hydrogen value chain. We are prepared to help promoters in implementing their investment strategies. But to decarbonize in the continent by 2050, this implies a new and urgent element. This implies cohesion investment based on just transition mechanism as part of the European Green Deal, as referred by Commissioner Elisa Ferreira. A long history of investment support for cohesion in Europe is the foundation of our role in implementing the just transition mechanism. The Commission will count on us. The just transition mechanism will support regions in their transition away from fossil fuels to low carbon, vital in synchronizing cohesion and climate action. It provides targeted support to help mobilizing at least 150 billion euros over the period 2021-2027 in the most affected regions. It is a key tool to ensure that the transition is fair, leaving no one behind. But how to finance this, you may ask. The IB is one of the largest supranational issuers of green bonds. The climate awareness bonds, we call it. We issued the first ever green bond in 2007. Since then, we established a regular presence in the market. having raised 31 billion euros in green bonds across a variety of currencies. We are building a euro-denominated green bond curve, and we play a crucial role in the development of the green bond market. More recently, in 2018, we launched the first sustainable awareness bond to support sustainable projects that go beyond climate change mitigation. The criteria for sustainable awareness bonds was even extended to include financing directly related to the fight against the coronavirus pandemic. The IB issued 4 sustainability awareness bonds from a value of 2.4 billion euros since the outbreak of the pandemic. The vast track record of the IB will contribute to lead the way in demonstrating the application of EU taxonomy and champion the EU standards globally. This will have a significant contribution to the development of a green capital markets union. Europe's financial markets remain two-bank-based. Therefore, completion of the capital market union is essential to facilitate deeper and more diverse financing. We need to revamp the EU initiative to remove barriers that hamper deeper and liquid risk financing markets in Europe. Many issues remain, despite a gradual shifting investor interest towards companies with clearly defined sustainability goals in the recent period. Enhanced information and the development of simple and transparent standards should contribute to alleviate major impediments to stronger growth in the green bond market. The IB is contributing to a greater harmonization with respect to climate change-related disclosure and the development of reliable and comparable data and indicators in line with that promoted for all green issuance under the EU taxonomy. But Europe is also a global research and innovation powerhouse. It's a leading economy in terms of investment in research and development. With only 7% of the population in the world, Europe accounts for 20% of global R&D investments, produces 1/3 of the high-quality scientific publications, and holds a world-leading position in many industrial sectors. Notwithstanding public R&D investment capacity and scientific performance, the EU lags behind competitors such as the United States and China in R&D investment levels, and has fewer new world-leading companies. The European Union has not reached its self-set target of 3% of GDP investment in R&D by 2020. The EIB Group is one of the largest public supporters of innovation in the EU. We provide long-term capital and advisory support. The EIB Group is also the largest provider of venture capital in the European Union. We support half of the European Union unicorns that have emerged in the past 15 years, mostly in the early stages of their development. Skype, Skyscanner, WeTransfer, and TransferWise, BlaBlaCar, Spotify, Shazam, Just Eat, Farfetch, Rovio, and Zalando are all companies we supported. We design financial instruments that absorb risks that banks and other investors take when they finance riskier and innovative endeavors. Our lending is seen by market participants as a seal of excellence due to high technical and quality assessment we carry out. This backing encourages banks to lend and other private players to invest, creating a sustainable finance ecosystem for innovation. InvestEU is the program that, building on the successful model of the Juncker Plan, addresses these challenges. InvestEU will provide the European Union with crucial long-term funding by leveraging substantial private and public funds in support of a sustainable recovery with innovation and digital transition. The InvestEU guarantee amounts to 26.2 billion euros, with provisioning from the multi-annual financial framework and next generation EU resources. The overall investment to be mobilized is estimated at 372 billion euros. The EIB Group will play a pivotal role in InvestEU, being responsible for implementing 75% of due guarantee, and for the management of the technical advisory components. Allow me to conclude by addressing the sensitive issue of the strategic autonomy of Europe. In the recent period, global trade tensions intensified further. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown how global supply chains can be affected and disrupted in challenging times. In this context, the strategic autonomy of Europe has gained relevance to secure critical value chains for EU recovery and economic independence. The EU recently announced a new trade strategy to address the challenges it faces. To face the economic recovery, to face the climate change, to face the growing international tensions, to face the retrocession of multilateralism and its terrible consequences for the post-war multilateral world in which we lived most of our lives. The new strategy will further integrate EU trade policy within our economic priorities, as reflected in the Green Deal and the European Digital Strategy. It defines trade policy's role in the post-COVID economic recovery and support the pursuit of the EU's geopolitical ambitions. As such, it will show how trade policy supports the EU open strategy autonomy. The open strategic autonomy is a part of the new strategy and reflects EU desire to chart its own course in the global stage, shaping the world through leadership, cooperation, engagement, while preserving our values without imposing them on others. The EIB, as the EU bank, is prepared to continue expanding its activity outside EU borders, to set up an autonomous development dedicated such the area. To conclude, 2021 is being a very challenging year. I believe we all have noticed it from the start. We'll play an important role in response to the COVID-19 crisis, while at the same time pushing for a green and smart recovery. We remain focused in supporting cohesion. Structural differences persist across member states and were even increased by the COVID-19 economic crisis. We need to promote a competitive and sustainable economy in support of a strong internal market and economic and social convergence. That lays the ground for our strategic autonomy. EU policy priorities have been dramatically reordered in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, but fighting climate change is imperative, no less than that. The recovery must be green and smart to build a resilient economy, an economy that delivers to the EU citizens, an economy that delivers to the current and to the next generations. In a Europe united, in a Europe of freedom, solidarity and prosperity, in a sustainable Europe of the European citizens. For this, we need to deliver now. Following an influential 20th century poet, this is no time for circumlocutions, this is no time for learned speech. This is a time for action because the future is within reach. This is the time because there is no time. Thank you very much, and gold rings on you all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Vice President Ricardo Mourinho Felix. And with this, we would close the conference. I just would like to reiterate that if all the participants would have any question, we are more welcome to then get back to you later. Thank you very much, all the panelists, presenters, and attendees for your time.